May 2nd, 1968, Forward Operating Base. Loc Ninh, South Vietnam. The radio crackled, static mixed with desperation, voices breaking apart under the sound of automatic weapons fire. It came through the speaker like popcorn at full speed. Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez stood in the operations tent, listening to the frequency assigned to a 12-man reconnaissance team. They were operating west of the base, near the Cambodian border. 3 Green Berets, 9 Montagnard tribesmen. They'd been inserted 4 hours earlier to gather intelligence on confirmed North Vietnamese army activity. Now they were surrounded, calling for emergency extraction. 2 helicopters had already tried to get them out. Both came back damaged, unable to land through the curtain of small arms and anti-aircraft fire. Benavidez knew the team leader personally. Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright had saved his life months earlier, when the 3rd helicopter spun up its rotors for another attempt. Benavidez grabbed a medical bag and ran toward it. He carried no rifle. The crew chief shouted something about not being assigned to the mission. Benavidez climbed aboard anyway. The helicopter climbed toward a jungle clearing where an entire North Vietnamese battalion waited. And Roy Benavidez was about to prove that one man's refusal to abandon his brothers could rewrite the mathematics of survival itself. What began as a voluntary decision to help extract trapped soldiers would transform into 6 hours of continuous combat. It would leave Benavidez with 37 separate wounds, declared dead and zipped into a body bag, until he summoned enough strength to spit in a doctor's face to prove he was still alive. The UH-1 Huey helicopter banked toward the tree line west of Loc Ninh. The pilot searched for any gap in the canopy that would allow descent. There was none. The jungle below was triple canopy monsoon forest, vegetation so dense that visibility ended 10 feet from any position. The radio traffic from the trapped reconnaissance team came in fragments now, voices shouting over gunfire that hadn't slowed in 4 hours. The pilot brought the Huey into a hover, 30 feet above the trees, too high for a safe jump, too low to avoid the small arms fire that immediately began hitting the fuselage. It sounded like gravel thrown against sheet metal. Benavidez looked down at jungle that offered no visible landing zone, no clear ground, nothing but green canopy hiding an NVA battalion that had already disabled 2 helicopters. He grabbed his medical bag. The crew chief grabbed his arm and shouted that the aircraft could not land. Benavidez nodded and jumped anyway. He hit branches 20 feet up, crashed through undergrowth, and landed hard on ground that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Before he could orient himself, he was hit 3 times in rapid succession. The first round struck his face, shattering bone and tearing through soft tissue. The second hit his head, fragmenting skull and producing instant concussion. The third caught his right leg above the knee, spinning him sideways. Pain registered as abstract information his brain cataloged but didn't process. He had approximately 75 meters to cover to reach the reconnaissance team's position. The NVA soldiers firing at him were positioned in prepared fighting positions, interlocking fields of fire, designed to prevent exactly what he was attempting. Every tactical principle taught at Fort Bragg said movement under these conditions was suicide. Benavidez ran anyway, zigzagging through trees, using fallen logs for momentary cover, his boots slipping on mud and rotting vegetation. The 12-man team had compressed into a defensive circle, roughly 15 meters in diameter. 4 bodies lay motionless. 8 men were alive but wounded, some critically. Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright, the team leader, had taken shrapnel to both legs. He was directing fire from a prone position behind a fallen tree. The 9 Montagnard tribesmen who made up the bulk of the team were running low on ammunition, rationing shots, waiting for targets close enough to guarantee hits. Benavidez dropped into the perimeter and immediately began triage. Sucking chest wound, tourniquet the leg, morphine for the stomach wound. Combat medicine operated on brutal efficiency. Save who you can, document who you cannot. Keep moving or everyone dies. He organized the casualties by severity and began marking the position with colored smoke grenades, so the helicopter could locate them through the canopy. The pilot overhead radioed that he could see the smoke but couldn't land. The trees were too dense and the ground fire too intense. Benavidez would have to move casualties to a clearing 100 meters northeast, where the canopy thinned enough for extraction. 100 meters, 8 wounded men, an NVA battalion surrounding the position. The mathematics were impossible, But mathematics had stopped mattering the moment Benavidez jumped from a hovering helicopter into a kill zone. Because his friend needed help. The reconnaissance team had been sent to gather intelligence on confirmed large-scale enemy activity. They'd found it. An entire NVA battalion, possibly more, controlled this sector and patrolled it routinely. The team's insertion had been detected almost immediately, and NVA soldiers had maneuvered into ambush positions before the Americans could establish defensive security. Now Benavidez surveyed the perimeter and understood with absolute clarity. Reaching these men had been the easy part. Getting them out would require 6 hours of continuous fighting against an enemy that outnumbered them 100 to 1 and controlled every approach route to the only viable extraction point. The first task was organizing chaos into something defensible. Benavidez moved through the perimeter, cataloging what remained. 4 bodies, 8 wounded, ammunition scattered across positions where men had fallen while reloading, medical supplies limited to what the team had carried, plus the bag he'd brought. The NVA fire hadn't slackened since his arrival. Rounds snapped through the canopy overhead, splintering wood and kicking up dirt, in patterns that revealed enemy positions surrounding them on 3 sides. Benavidez's Special Forces training had prepared him for exactly this impossible situation. Not prepared him to survive it, just prepared him to function within it, long enough to give others a chance. He began with the wounded who could still fight. Dress the wound, apply pressure, morphine if the pain threatened shock, but not so much they couldn't hold a rifle. Private First Class Brian O'Connor, the team's radio man, had taken shrapnel to the shoulder, but he could still operate the PRC-25 radio. That radio represented their only connection to air support and extraction coordination. Benavidez positioned O'Connor behind the thickest tree available, told him to maintain continuous contact with the forward air controller circling overhead. The 9 Montagnard tribesmen were running on final magazines. Benavidez moved to the 4 bodies, removed their ammunition, weapons, and grenades, and redistributed everything to fighting positions around the perimeter. The dead had no further use for equipment. The living needed every round. Establishing a defensive perimeter in jungle terrain required understanding fields of fire through vegetation. Vegetation that blocked visibility beyond 10 meters. Benavidez positioned men to cover the most likely enemy approach routes, focusing on gaps where NVA soldiers could advance unseen until they were within grenade range. He called in smoke grenades to mark their position for the air support inbound from Bien Hoa Air Base. Purple smoke billowed up through the canopy, visible to aircraft, but also marking their exact location for every enemy soldier in the area. The risk was calculated. Without airstrikes, the NVA would simply overrun the position through mass assault. With airstrikes, they had minutes of relief, purchased at the cost of revealing themselves. The first A-1 Sky Raider arrived within 10 minutes, a single-engine attack aircraft designed in 1945, but still effective for close air support in 1968. The pilot radioed for confirmation of the target. Benavidez directed him to drop ordnance on the tree line 50 meters north, where the heaviest fire originated. The Sky Raider rolled in, released high explosive bombs, and pulled up. Secondary explosions indicated ammunition stores detonating. The NVA fire slackened momentarily. Benavidez used the pause to move 2 more casualties to positions closer to the clearing, where the next helicopter would attempt extraction. Every meter covered now meant 1 less meter to drag wounded men under fire later. The airstrikes bought time but solved nothing. Each sortie drove the NVA back temporarily, but they returned within minutes, probing for weaknesses, testing whether the Americans had reinforcements or were isolated and dying. Benavidez knew the answer. No ground reinforcements were coming, the jungle terrain prevented rapid movement, and any relief force would take hours to reach them through the same NVA-controlled territory. Survival depended entirely on air support and successful helicopter extraction. O'Connor radioed that a second Huey was inbound. Estimated arrival 12 minutes. 12 minutes to prepare casualties for movement. 12 minutes for the NVA to reposition. 12 minutes before everything depended on whether a helicopter could land in a clearing, surrounded by an enemy battalion that had already disabled 3 aircraft. Benavidez began moving casualties toward the extraction point, dragging men who couldn't walk, supporting those who could. The mathematics remained impossible, But incremental progress towards survival was the only available option. The clearing appeared through breaks in the canopy, approximately 100 meters northeast of the perimeter, small enough that the Huey would have to descend vertically, with no running start, large enough that if the pilot could hold it steady for 90 seconds, 8 wounded men might survive. Benavidez had moved 3 casualties to within 30 meters of the clearing. By the time the helicopter's rotors became audible over the ongoing firefight, he waved orange smoke to mark the approach. The Huey descended through the canopy, taking hits immediately, the distinctive metallic impacts of small arms fire hitting aluminum airframe, mixing with the turbine whine and rotor wash that flattened vegetation in expanding circles beneath the aircraft. The pilot brought the Huey down hard, skids hitting earth and bouncing once before settling. The crew chief and door gunner opened fire with M60 machine guns mounted on either side, while Benavidez began dragging casualties toward the open cabin. The helicopter extraction doctrine was simple in theory and nearly impossible in practice. Load casualties, maintain suppressing fire. Depart before ground fire disabled the aircraft. Every second on the ground multiplied the probability of catastrophic damage. The UH-1 Huey's turbine engine, transmission, fuel tanks, hydraulic lines, and rotor system were all vulnerable to small arms fire. A single round through the right component could transform a flying aircraft into a burning wreck. In seconds. The pilots knew this. The crew knew this. Benavidez knew this. They loaded casualties anyway. First man in, second, third. Benavidez ran back for the 4th casualty, while tracer rounds arced overhead in patterns that revealed NVA positions had shifted closer during the extraction attempt. 4th man loaded, 5th. The helicopter was approaching maximum weight capacity with wounded soldiers, crew, and fuel. 6th casualty loaded, 7th. One more trip. Benavidez turned to retrieve the last wounded man, when he saw the pilot's head snap forward against the instrument panel. A single round had entered through the windscreen and killed him instantly. The co-pilot grabbed the controls, attempted to compensate, but the Huey was already settling wrong, nose dipping, tail rotor losing authority. The aircraft tilted, main rotor struck vegetation, and the transmission housing sheared its mounting bolts. The Huey dropped the final 8 feet and hit hard enough to collapse the left skid and rupture fuel lines. Fire started immediately. Aviation fuel ignited across hot engine components and spread into the cabin where 7 wounded soldiers were trapped in webbing seats they couldn't escape. Benavidez ran toward the burning aircraft without conscious decision, his body moving on, training and instinct. That overrode the rational knowledge that entering a fuel fire meant death. He reached the cabin door and began pulling men out, dragging them across ground that was rapidly becoming obscured by black smoke. The ammunition stored in the Huey began cooking off, rounds firing in random directions as the heat detonated primers. Benavidez pulled the 7th man clear and went back for the crew. The co-pilot was unconscious, slumped against his harness. Benavidez cut the restraints and dragged him away from the aircraft. Seconds before the main fuel tank exploded, throwing debris across the clearing and igniting secondary fires in the surrounding vegetation. They were now worse off than before the helicopter arrived. 7 casualties extracted from the burning wreck joined the original wounded, for a total of 15 men requiring evacuation. The dead pilot's body remained in the cockpit. The burning helicopter marked their exact position with smoke visible for miles. The NVA had watched the entire sequence and understood that the Americans had just lost their extraction platform. Benavidez felt the grenade detonation before he heard it, fragments tearing through his left thigh and lower back. He dropped, registered the new wounds, and stood up anyway, because stopping meant everyone died. The perimeter had to be re-established around the crash site. The wounded had to be triaged again. Air support had to be called in immediately to prevent the NVA from overrunning a position that was now marked by a burning beacon, visible to every enemy soldier in the province. And somewhere, another helicopter would have to be convinced to attempt what had just killed a pilot and destroyed a perfectly good aircraft. The mathematics had shifted from impossible to absurd, but Benavidez began organizing the casualties anyway, because the alternative was surrender, and that option had never existed. Time stopped being measured in minutes. It fragmented into immediate tasks that defined survival for the next 30 seconds. Call airstrike, distribute ammunition, Apply tourniquet, return fire. The battle entered its third hour with no indication it would end before everyone died. Benavidez moved through the expanded perimeter, checking casualties, redistributing equipment from men too wounded to fight, and maintaining radio contact with the forward air controller, who had become their lifeline to continued existence. The A-1 Sky Raiders returned in cycles, dropping ordnance on NVA positions. That reformed within minutes after each strike. The enemy understood the Americans had nowhere to go and were operating on exhausted ammunition supplies. Standard doctrine said wait them out, let them burn through their remaining rounds, then overrun the position at close range, where air support became useless. The tactical reality of small unit survival in hostile territory required understanding resource management under impossible conditions. Fire discipline meant every round had to count. Soldiers couldn't spray automatic fire into vegetation, where enemy soldiers might be hiding. They had to identify targets, confirm range, and shoot only when hits were probable. The psychological component was equally critical. The NVA was conducting psychological warfare by maintaining continuous harassment fire, forcing the Americans to stay prone, denying them rest, eroding morale through the simple expedient of never letting up. Benavidez countered this by moving constantly, checking each position, maintaining communication, demonstrating through his presence that leadership hadn't abandoned them, and extraction remained possible. He was wounded again during the fourth hour. A burst of AK-47 fire caught him across the stomach, rounds penetrating abdominal wall and perforating intestines. He dropped, felt blood soaking his uniform, and assessed damage with the clinical detachment that trauma sometimes produces. Not immediately fatal. Battlefield medicine offered no treatment beyond pressure, dressing, and hope. He applied the dressing and continued moving. Thigh wound from grenade fragments earlier, back wound, face wound, head wound, right leg, left thigh, stomach. He'd stopped counting after 7 separate injuries. His medical bag was empty. Morphine was gone. Bandages were improvised from torn uniform fabric. The 15 casualties under his care had received everything available. His own wounds would have to wait for evacuation. That might never come. The NVA assault came during the 5th hour, as coordinated probes from multiple directions simultaneously. Small units of 5 to 8 soldiers would advance to within grenade range, attack one section of the perimeter, withdraw before air support could engage, then attack from a different angle 30 minutes later. The tactic was sound. It prevented the Americans from reinforcing any single position and forced them to defend the entire perimeter with insufficient manpower. Benavidez moved between positions, carrying ammunition, directing fire, and personally engaging enemy soldiers who breached the defensive line. He picked up weapons from casualties, fired until magazines were empty, dropped them, and grabbed the next rifle available. At some point, he was using an AK-47, taken from a dead NVA soldier, because American weapons had run dry. O'Connor's radio crackled with confirmation that a 3rd helicopter was en route. Estimated arrival 20 minutes. Benavidez acknowledged and began organizing casualties for movement. 20 minutes meant 4 more enemy assault cycles. 20 minutes meant the NVA could reposition heavy weapons to target the landing zone. 20 minutes meant every soldier still breathing had to hold their position, against an enemy that now understood this was their final chance to prevent American extraction. The mathematics remained absurd. 15 casualties requiring evacuation. 1 functioning helicopter after 2 had been destroyed. An NVA battalion preparing a final assault to overrun the position before the Americans could escape. But Benavidez organized the casualties anyway, because 6 hours of impossible survival meant nothing if they died in the final 20 minutes. The 3rd Huey descended through the same killing zone that had claimed the 2nd aircraft, taking hits immediately but maintaining controlled descent. The pilot held the hover while door gunners laid down suppressing fire that carved visible lanes through the vegetation. Benavidez began moving casualties toward the aircraft, dragging men across ground churned to mud by 6 hours of fighting. First man loaded, second, third. The process had become mechanical repetition, stripped of hope or fear, just bodies moved from point A to point B, because that was the remaining task. Fourth man, fifth. He turned to retrieve the sixth casualty, when he saw movement in his peripheral vision, too close to be friendly. The NVA soldier emerged from undergrowth 3 meters away, rifle with fixed bayonet, already moving in a thrust pattern aimed at center mass. Combat at this range eliminated all tactical complexity. Benavidez had no time to raise a weapon, no time to shout warning, no time for anything except the collision of two men whose training had prepared them to kill at contact distance. The bayonet entered his abdomen below the rib cage, blade penetrating peritoneum and cutting through intestinal tissue, already damaged by the earlier gunshot wound. The steel scraped bone as the soldier drove it deeper, twisting to maximize internal trauma. Pain arrived as white static that briefly obscured conscious thought. Bayonet wounds represent some of the most devastating trauma in close combat, because the blade creates both penetrating and tearing injuries simultaneously. The insertion damages organs and blood vessels. The withdrawal creates additional tearing as serrated edges catch tissue. The twisting motion that trained soldiers employ multiplies internal injury through mechanical advantage that turns a narrow blade into a cavity-creating instrument. Survival depends on immediate surgical intervention. That was impossible in a jungle clearing, 6 hours from the nearest hospital. Benavidez understood this with the clarity that trauma sometimes produces. He was dying. The wound was fatal, but dying took time, and the time remaining could still serve purpose. He grabbed the rifle barrel with both hands, pulled it toward himself to prevent withdrawal, and drew his own knife from its belt sheath. The NVA soldier tried to pull his weapon free. Benavidez held it in place, with grip strength fueled by the knowledge that releasing it meant death in seconds rather than minutes. He drove his knife upward into the soldier's torso, found resistance, pushed harder, felt the blade penetrate vital structures. The soldier's eyes registered surprise before the light left them. Benavidez let him fall, leaving his own knife embedded in the body. Because retrieving it required movement, his abdominal muscles could no longer coordinate. 2 more NVA soldiers appeared from the tree line. He picked up the dead soldier's AK-47, fired from the hip, because raising the weapon to shoulder height was impossible, and dropped both targets with short, controlled bursts. The helicopter crew chief was shouting something about time and fuel. Benavidez dragged the last 3 casualties to the Huey, lifted them into the cabin using arm strength alone, because his core muscles had been destroyed by bayonet and bullets, and collapsed against the fuselage, unable to take another step. The crew chief grabbed him and pulled him aboard as the helicopter lifted. The clearing fell away beneath them, smoke from the burning wreckage marking the position they'd defended for 6 hours against overwhelming force. Benavidez tried to speak, to confirm all casualties were accounted for, but vocal cords wouldn't respond to brain signals. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. Sound became distant and distorted. The last thing he registered before losing consciousness was the crew chief's face above him, lips moving in words that might have been prayer, or might have been condolences for a dying man. The helicopter banked toward Loch Ninh, climbing to altitude where ground fire could no longer reach them. Behind them, the jungle swallowed all evidence of the battle, except smoke that would dissipate within hours. Inside the Huey, 15 wounded men lay in positions that ranged from critical to catastrophic. Roy Benavidez was the most critical of all. Unconscious, bleeding from wounds the crew chief had stopped counting after 20. The Huey touched down at the medical facility at Loch Ninh, and personnel swarmed the aircraft before the skids settled. Triage began immediately. Combat medicine in 1968 operated under brutal protocols, designed to save the maximum number of lives. Under conditions where resources could never match casualties, doctors moved through the wounded, making decisions measured in seconds. This one lives if we operate now. This one dies regardless. This one might survive with basic stabilization. Sort the salvageable from the dying and move fast, because the next helicopter was already inbound, with more casualties that would require the same impossible calculations. Benavidez was carried from the helicopter on a stretcher and placed on the ground while a doctor performed rapid assessment. No detectable pulse, no respiratory effort, pupils fixed and dilated. The doctor checked for carotid pulse again, found nothing, and moved to the next casualty. A medic placed Benavidez among the dead, bodies laid in rows awaiting transportation to graves registration. In 1968, combat zones, The medical definition of death was pragmatic rather than absolute. If battlefield conditions prevented detection of vital signs, and immediate intervention wouldn't restore function, the casualty was classified as deceased. Mistakes happened. Men were occasionally declared dead, who still retained minimal life signs, undetectable under field conditions. But the alternative was wasting resources on corpses, while salvageable wounded died waiting for treatment. Sergeant First Class Brian O'Connor, the radio man Benavidez had positioned behind a tree 6 hours earlier, was being carried past the rows of dead. When he recognized Benavidez's face, he shouted for the doctor. The physician returned, examined Benavidez again, and confirmed no vital signs. O'Connor insisted. The doctor explained that the man was dead, had been dead when he arrived, and nothing could be done. As the doctor began to zip the body bag closed, Benavidez summoned the last reserves of strength his body contained and spat blood directly into the physician's face. The doctor froze, checked for pulse again, found weak but present heartbeat. Emergency surgery was ordered immediately. The surgical team at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio spent the next year reconstructing what combat had destroyed. 37 separate wounds documented in medical records. 7 major gunshot wounds, multiple shrapnel injuries, bayonet penetration of the abdomen requiring intestinal resection, broken jaw, skull fracture, compound fractures in both legs. The prognosis was guarded. He would likely never walk again. Brain damage from the head wound might be permanent. Internal injuries could produce complications years later, but Roy Benavidez was alive, which violated every statistical probability. That should have applied to a man who'd sustained those injuries. While fighting, for 6 continuous hours, he received the Distinguished Service Cross in September 1968, while still hospitalized, presented by General William Westmoreland. The citation documented extraordinary heroism, voluntary action beyond the call of duty, and direct responsibility for saving the lives of at least 8 men. But the recommendation for the Medal of Honor, submitted by Lieutenant Colonel Ralph R. Drake, was denied. The Army Decorations Board required an eyewitness account from someone present during the action. The survivors had all been severely wounded, evacuated under morphine, and debriefed while their memories were fragmented by trauma and drugs. Their statements corroborated general events, but lacked the detailed specificity that Medal of Honor documentation required. Without a living witness capable of providing comprehensive testimony, the upgrade was impossible. Benavidez retired from the Army in 1976 with the rank of Master Sergeant, his body rebuilt through surgeries, but marked permanently by scars. That mapped 6 hours in hell. The Distinguished Service Cross honored what he'd done, but it didn't fully document the reality of jumping from a helicopter into a kill zone because a friend needed help, refusing to surrender when surrounded, and spitting blood in a doctor's face to prove death hadn't yet won. Roy Benavidez retired in 1976, believing that what he'd done on May 2, 1968 would never receive full recognition. The Distinguished Service Cross honored extraordinary heroism, but he knew it didn't capture the complete reality of 6 hours fighting an entire battalion to save 8 lives. The problem wasn't bureaucratic indifference. The problem was evidence. The Medal of Honor required eyewitness testimony from someone present during the action, and Benavidez believed all witnesses had been too severely wounded to provide the detailed accounts that military regulations demanded. Their memories were fragmented by trauma, morphine, and evacuation procedures. That separated survivors before comprehensive debriefing could occur. Without a living witness capable of documenting specific actions in specific sequence, the upgrade was impossible, regardless of how many people believed he deserved it. The Medal of Honor criteria existed for sound reasons. Since 1917, when Congress had removed 911 incorrectly awarded medals in the purge of 1917, the Department of Defense required thorough battlefield investigation and direct eyewitness testimony before awarding the nation's highest military decoration. Only 178 Distinguished Service Crosses out of more than 13,000 issued had ever been upgraded to Medal of Honor. The standards protected the award's significance by preventing inflation through political pressure or inadequate documentation. But the standards also meant that extraordinary valor could go unrecognized. if witnesses died or disappeared before testimony could be recorded. In 1980, Brian O'Connor sat in a hotel in Australia, reading a newspaper during holiday from his home in Fiji. An article about Roy Benavidez, originally published in El Campo, Texas, and picked up by International Wire Services, described a Green Beret who'd saved 8 lives during 6 hours of combat. O'Connor recognized the story immediately because he'd lived it. He was the radio man Benavidez had positioned behind a tree while organizing the defensive perimeter. He'd been severely wounded, evacuated to the United States before superiors could fully debrief him, and had been living overseas, unaware that his testimony was the missing piece, preventing Medal of Honor recognition. O'Connor contacted Benavidez immediately and submitted a 10-page eyewitness report, documenting every action in precise sequence. The report confirmed accounts from other survivors and provided the legally required evidence. On February 24, 1981, President Ronald Reagan presented Roy P. Benavidez with the Medal of Honor at the Pentagon. Reagan turned to the assembled press and said words that would become inseparable from Benavidez's legacy. If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it. Reagan then read the official citation. That documented jumping from a helicopter into a kill zone, treating wounded under continuous fire, organizing airstrikes, surviving 37 wounds, and spitting blood to prove he was alive. The ceremony corrected a 13-year documentation error, but it also raised uncomfortable questions. How many other Roy Benavidez had performed extraordinary actions, witnessed by men who died before providing testimony? How many Medal of Honor-worthy acts vanished into classified files or incomplete reports? Because bureaucracy required evidence that combat destroyed, Benavidez spent his remaining years speaking to youth groups, mentoring underprivileged children, and pushing back against gang recruitment by demonstrating that military service offered better paths than street violence. He advocated successfully for continuation of disability benefits for Vietnam veterans in 1983. He became a living symbol. That heroism wasn't supernatural ability, but ordinary men making impossible choices, because the alternative was abandoning brothers. On November 29, 1998, Roy Benavidez died at age 63 and was buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. The Medal of Honor documented what he'd done. The 8 men who survived May 2, 1968, because he refused to leave them, testified to what it meant, and Brian O'Connor's accidental discovery of a newspaper article in Australia proved that sometimes justice delayed could still be justice delivered, if witnesses survived long enough to tell the truth.